Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Joe Biel, author of People's Guide to Publishing. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Are you ready to get started?
I am.
All right, question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
So this is something that I do every day because I've been a publisher for 23 years. That's been my day job. And so I am constantly in this position. And often I find that the author hasn't done any market analysis, or they have sort of an idea that what they believe is a popular concept, but they have nothing to support that theory. And so I'm often redirecting authors back to their local bookstore to, see where their conceptions are right and wrong. And often, that's something simple like, go look at the shelf where your book would appear and look at where there's a cavity, like where is there a gap in the information that your expertise and interest sort of occupies, And often they will argue with me about this, which is so confounding because, in their mind, they feel like a certain niche is very crowded, but they're often going for a very crowded niche in reality. And so, I have, one of the things that People's Guide to Publishing does is it sort of creates a mathematical theorem for how to assess where there is a gap in the market, and then how to fill that, and then how to make sure there's enough of an audience for that gap. Because, obviously sometimes there's a reason that there's a gap, is that, nobody's buying those kinds of books. And so, often it's just to make sure there's somebody, because, there's an audience for almost every kind of book. And it really comes down to developing your book in a way that it connects with the right audience.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
I guess it's the, I've done 8 books since I think 1997 of my own, and that, so I come at this kind of from both sides, and so I know it's tremendously annoying just how long the timelines are and how difficult the things. It's funny because nothing happens quickly in publishing, and then on top of that, it's like the industry and the sort of the people that keep the gates are remarkably fickle in that way. And so often, I've had it where I've sold numerous books, and then a certain editor will get let go from a company, or just like their boss doesn't like how something comes in, and then there's kind of a pushback to reshape it, or worst of all, their replacement is sort of hard leveraging it to be a different book than we sort of agreed on in the first place. And so those things, it's always just I get it, it's nobody goes into publishing for the money, but and so most people are coming at it for meaning and purpose, sort of to fulfill a lifelong dream or creative passions or whatnot. And so, I think it's really hard to sort of ease up on that vision, and I think for a lot of people, when they do ease up on that vision, they kind of find that the end result book that is, sees publication 4 years later, they have no emotional investment in that, and I've seen that from both sides as well, where, sometimes to make something market ready, it's just not the book that you wanted it to be, and you don't love it anymore.
Well, let's talk a little bit about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
Sure, sure. So this has kind of been where I've excelled the most, actually. So one, we've done a lot of different things over time. One thing is we do a lot of events and we do a lot of conference appearances, and I've done speaking tours and that, and then we figured out eventually that making sort of a fold-out poster, because like narrative is such an important part of business today, and so what I did, and I don't even know, we kind of argue in the office about whose idea this was initially, but so one thing we did was kind of it's like a poster you put on your wall, but it's a comic that sort of tells the story of Microcosm, our company, and and it's my story as well as the founder, and then those, we had been making, traditional trade catalogs and, mailing those to retailers, and they were kind of getting glossier over the years as we were sort of responding to feedback from, our sales team and our field reps and, sort of the development people at various distributors that we worked with. But then gradually, it was kind of like the book, I talked about, like the catalog didn't really fit the company anymore. So the real kibosh that we did was to, I think the first printing we did was 10,000 of these, and and it's like a full color comic on like an uncoated paper. So it has like a nice like toothy, earthy kind of feel to it, like the paper's unbleached, and and it's like literally like the story. I think the first one we did was like the story of the publishing industry as depicted by dinosaurs, and then like we are sort of the rats beneath it, and like sort of how we came to thrive in that climate, and we went through those first 10,000 copies in 2 months, just, and not even like with any sort of active campaign, because people really liked them, and then we were just constantly getting requests for them, and and it was far more effective than our trade catalog. And, when we would pass them out on our tours and send them out with our mail orders, and then we would have people that would want to pass them out in their towns because it was like a cool, interesting thing. And then, we would have them when, just like also when I would just like go get tea somewhere, I could just like leave 20 of them, somewhere like with the free newspapers. And, it's like, it's still to this day, like I take a little stack every time I go to our downtown public library. And every single time that I put some there, like we get a fan letter, and that, I just feel like that is so the like most, we call it the ground game at work, because it's just like so much of the time people are really thinking that like distribution is how you reach an audience, but it just doesn't do that, because it's like there's millions of books in print, so there's just no reason why like a consumer needs to like understand fundamentally who you are. And so I think in that way, it's like storytelling and sort of owning your own narrative in that way is, why you're an expert on a subject, why you have a unique story to tell, things like that, like why your perspective is different than other people's. Like people, readers are really responsive to that. And, I wouldn't have been very confident about that myself, other than the fact of like, now we go through, 60, 70,000 of these things every year, and so that was really shocking, because I didn't really foresee it going like that. And now we print, I think it's like 2,500 trade catalogs, and it used to be that I think when we started, I think our peak for our trade was something like 60,000 too, but it was just like, people don't, like they kind of treat it like it's garbage, whereas like we get so many messages that are like, I still have the one from 3 years ago on my wall, or I get rid of everything, but I held on to that, and so that's been just super, like like that's the feedback that I pass on to almost everybody. And then we do kind of like reverse astroturfing campaigns a lot too that are really effective. We did one where we had an author who she had a pretty large fan base and had over 10,000 followers on Twitter. And so what we did was we had all of her followers write negative reviews for her book on Amazon. And then we were encouraging them to buy direct instead. And it was amazing because it broke the Amazon algorithm. Like, they didn't have a way to deal with that, And so the funniest part was that it was still rising in rank on Amazon because it was like people going to the page, people writing reviews. It was still getting the interaction. And then, it came out years later that, Amazon prioritizes like what they call organic reviews, and, they don't want only 5-star reviews. So like in that way, like writing these absurd reviews, like, envelope the book arrived in was not manila enough, or, things like this was actually helping the book, which was just like completely silly. And it was something that like was amusing for us, and it was a lot easier to get that than to like ask people to write, 5-star glowing reviews, because it sort of apes the culture that we're in, and I think for a lot of fans, especially myself, it's like that's something that's way more fun than, where you're like, I don't know what to write that's like glowing or, flattering praise. Like it's much easier to like see the sort of sarcastic posts that people are making and be like, oh, I have an idea. And then similarly, we did a campaign, I think 10 years ago now, maybe a little bit more, where we traded in people's unwanted Kindles that they got for Christmas in exchange for books. Like we gave them an equitable value in physical books from our warehouse in exchange for their Kindle. And that was, similarly like a lot of fun. And, we like still get phone calls asking if we're still doing that, which I just loved, And so things like that, it's like, it's like marketing is really like the creative part of, of publishing, And so things like that. And, I wrote a lot of case studies in People's Guide to Publishing about like what other people have done. And, and a lot of it really just comes down to like owning your story and like not trying to be, non-fat plain yogurt, because I think that's kind of how a lot of people approach publishing is like, I don't want to have a personality or show you too many of my opinions. And I don't think that is the climate we live in anymore. I think people sort of want to know how an author feels about things and sort of where they land on, certain issues. And, it creates like a more of a emotional proximity than, I think in a lot of cases, we run into these things where the author is just so nervous to express themselves at all, that they don't want to, And so I don't know, I'd say it's like be who you are and like figure that out early on and be confident in it.
Well, in regards to your poster strategy, so essentially on the poster, you're telling the story about the book and about your company. How much does that typically cost to have a poster like that created? Because that's a great idea for people that are wanting to get their books launched to have an additional item like a bookmark or a poster. So how does that process work in regards to getting those posters done, and in regards to design, and then also the investments of how much it typically costs for each poster?
Sure. So I think the first run of those we did when we just did 10,000. I think that was about $2,000 to print and ship those. Like we had them freighted in because it's like where we are, there's just no reasonable local printing. And then I did the design myself, so there wasn't that expense. I mean, it definitely took me several days of work, but it wasn't. And that was kind of when it was more of an experiment. And, now we're at the point where we hire an artist, and like, so it looks a little different every time. But it is, I guess that's the thing. It's like in the older days, we would just print like a postcard, and that would be like $200 for 5,000. And that, and that's definitely like a much more economical option. But it's really hard to say something substantial and meaningful that way. So, and I guess it's just a thing where I feel like in publishing, there's this aversion to spending money in general. And there's this idea that like you should get something without paying for anything. And, like similarly with how like print-on-demand technologies work and the like, and, people using their friends as editorial instead of professionals. And, and I understand the need to be frugal, but at the same time, it's like, marketing is really the thing that makes people buy your book, at the end of the day.
Absolutely. You got to spend money to make money, and marketing is key. Otherwise, it's going to fall into the Amazon rainforest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Sure. So I kind of struggled with this one, so I have kind of two tied contenders. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
No worries.
I really, and I was trying to think of like things that, like I had so many books where I learned so many things, but, it's a whole convoluted story. So our finalists today are The CIA's Greatest Hits by Philip Melanson, and I think that one was 1993. And and it's funny because it's just like a book of like one-page vignettes, and then there's like a page of art for each story. And then sometimes if the story is really complicated, it'll be like 2 or 3 pages of narrative. And it just really, like, that book really opened me up to formats and like how to make history compelling, because that was sort of the book that I didn't have a high school education, and so I hadn't had, and even when I was in high school, I hadn't had a single book assigned to me to read. So I kind of thought that stuff was boring, and it was really that book, The CIA's Greatest Hits, where I was just like, all of this stuff is so fascinating, and there's just so much oddity in American history and in world history that it made me dig deeper on all of that stuff. And that was probably the most informing book for my own publishing, because I was like, this is how the kind of book that I want to make, and even though I didn't start my own publishing until 96, it was like, I think it was like deep in my subconscious was that book, And then more recently, there's a book called We Don't Think You're Racist, which is a it's done by an LA comedian, and it's sort of similar but not, because it has a sort of a picture of a person, and then it has a quote from them, sort of, which is like a tongue-in-cheek take on perhaps the most racist thing that has been said to them. So it's things like, you deserve an award for not walking across the street to get away from me, and it's an amazing book because everybody kind of feels like they're in on the joke, and it sort of explains best how, sort of these attitudes are ridiculous, or, and for me, it's like, it's the only book that I've seen where it doesn't have sort of a like cloud of academia or like any exclusion around it at all. It's like you pick up that book and you're like, this is fascinating. It's funny. And, I sell them to bad teenagers all the time that like think they're getting away with something, just like I sell them to their parents, and so it's like, and so we've been trying to get the publishing rights, because it's currently between printings, or maybe it's out of print. But similarly, it like, just like the CIA's Greatest Hits, it's like it opened up my eyes to like how publishing could be, that it doesn't have to be sort of like a sterile, sort of boring thing. It can be like, it's like sort of like between a coffee table book and like the best, fantasy novel, because it like opens up your mind, and it's like speaks a lot more volumes than the words that are on the page.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Sure. So Peter Workman, who was the founder and the longtime publisher of Workman, he created this like 3-legged stool theorem that was like this: what is a successful book? And I wrote about it a lot in People's Guide to Publishing, because I feel like it's the one thing that best determines what is like you can more or less predict what will be a successful book before it's published. And, and so my favorite part, there's like sort of 3 parts of like, everybody has to like benefit from the book that touches it. And, the author needs to have like credential, and that needs to be sort of infallible, and there has to be a strong relationship with the publisher. But my favorite part of it is the part where he says that the book needs to disrupt every other book in the same category, and because I love that, because it's like the most egotistical thing to think of, both as an author and as a publisher, that you would change the game with that one book, but that's and so I don't quite think of it the same way that he does, but that's definitely my favorite quote.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Sure. So my personal website is joebiel.net, and our publishing website is www.microcosm.pub. Or if you're old school, you can go microcosmpublishing.com.
Well, Joe, I want to thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.